Boker Tov, Shavua Tov. We began the sugya, but just began it, of Reish Lakish here on Daf Kuf Yud Dalid Amid Beis. And this is about Tibul Rishon be Chazeres, in the case where he only has Moror for the first Tibul. And the question is, can he fulfill the mitzvah of Moror with a bracha later on, once he's already eaten the Moror for the Tibul Rishon earlier in the Seder before the matzah? And it all depends, says Reish Lakish, on whether mitzvah tzrichas kavana or ein tzrichas kavana. And according to the logic of Reish Lakish, if mitzvah's ein tzrichas kavana, then he automatically fulfills the mitzvah of Moror with Tibul Rishon. This, despite the fact that he had no kavana, he had no interest in fulfilling the mitzvah of Moror, but mitzvah's ein tzrichas kavana, then we're going to have a problem, because the Mishnah continues and tells us that when he gets to Tibul Sheni, he will take the Chazeres, the Moror, and he will dip it into Charoses and fulfill the mitzvah of Moror. Well, he already fulfilled the mitzvah of Moror, and that would be a problem, because he's going to make a bracha on the second Moror. But if I hold mitzvah tzrichas kavana, then it makes sense, as according to Reish Lakish, that he does not have kavana in the first tibul, and we're going to establish a takana that he should not have kavana in the first tibul, and therefore he would not be yotze the mitzvah of chazeres of Moror with the first tibul, because mitzvah tzrichas kavana. And the only bracha he's going to recite on the first tibul of Chazeres is only going to be Bori Pri Adama, the Birchas Hanenin. However, the bracha of Alachius Moror will be postponed until later, when he gets to the Moror after the matzah, and he's eating that Moror l'shem mitzvah. The first Moror he did not eat for the purpose and l'shem mitzvah, and therefore he wasn't yotze, because we're holding now mitzvah tzrichas kavana, and that kavana is an absolute requirement that's critical and indispensable with regard to the mitzvah. And the Gemara now rejects Reish Lakish by saying, Mimai, how does Reish Lakish actually know for sure that mitzvah ain't tzrichas kavana? Dilma, perhaps mitzvah tzrichas kavana. And then you can ask me, so why does he need the Tibul Sheni? And the Gemara answers, because the first Tibul is only l'shem hekera. There's an extra heker here to the Tinokos, that this night is not the same as any other night, because when do we have two Tibulim? And now the question is, okay, so the Gemara has convinced us that the purpose of the first tibul is heker litinokos, but nevertheless, if you hold mitzvah same tzrichas kavana, he could kill two birds with one stone, proverbially. He not only achieves his hekera, but he also achieves his mitzvah of chazeres, of Moror, because mitzvahs eino tzrichas kavana. But we could say that what the Gemara means is that the hekera will be established when he does a second tibul, because and therefore need the second tibul in order to clinch the hekera. But that doesn't mean that mitzvah tzrichas kavana, I could always hold mitzvah ain't tzrichas kavana. The problem is going to be, though, that why does he need, if you're asking me why does he need the shape tibul, that problem we could solve in order to create the hekera. But I would ask a different question, and that still remains a pressing issue. Why would he make a bracha al achilas Moror on the second Moror, since mitzvah ain't tzrichas kavana, he was yotze already his mitzvah Moror with the first Moror, the first tibul. So we want to look in the footnotes here, as we began this project on Thursday of last week. And in this case, we're looking at footnote number ches, just to summarize number zayin that we did last week. We said that there was a basic question here that was raised by the Rishonim, and they asked, even if mitzvahs ain't tzrichas kavana, why does he need a double tibul of chazeres? Shouldn't he have just been enough to do the second tibul to fulfill the mitzvah of morar? If Reish Lakish agrees that the first tibul is for hekel tinokos, so then what he's saying is that he should be able to be yotzei, right? In mitzvah strichas kavana, l'shemat tzorach l'tibul pamayim b'chazeres. Why wouldn't the second tibul be enough? Because right now, it would seem that the Gemara doesn't know yet the chiddush of Hekera. That's going to be the rejection of the Gemara, and maybe Mitzvah Saint Tzrichas Kavana, but he needs Trei Tibule for purpose of Hekera. But now in the Kasha of the Gemara, we thought that the Gemara was not aware of Hekera, and therefore, even if Mitzvah Tzrichas Kavana, we don't understand why he needs two Tibulim. Because let's assume that he didn't have kavanah on the first tibul. Okay, so we need the second tibul. So we spoke about the fact that the kavanah is that that the first tibul was not a mitzvah at all of tibul, and therefore we must be holding mitzvah tzrichas kavana. So the Gemara says, no, maybe even if mitzvahs ain't tzrichas kavana, but nevertheless he's going to add a second tibul for the purpose of a kera. Now again, we're talking about a case where the vegetable that he's using for tibul is chazeres, is mara. And we're assuming, of course, that now he's in that period of time where there's a chiyuv of achilas mara. But since mitzvah ain't tzrichas kavana, therefore he was yotzei with the first tibul, even if he didn't have kavana l'shem mitzvah in the first tibul. And the second tibul is only for the purpose of a kera. And we're going to look at footnote number ches on the third line. He says, "Is coming before shalolot says yidei chova." There is a possibility that even if I hold mitzvahs ein tzrichas kavana, he would nevertheless suspend and delay his kiyum mitzvah of mara until after the matzah for the second tibul, because he had explicit kavana in the first tibul, shalolotes. This is called kavana shalolotes. And even if I hold mitzvahs ein tzrichas kavana, that means the absence of kavana is not indispensable, if you pardon the double language. It's valid even if he has no kavana. But if he has a negative kavana, shalolotes, then everybody would agree he's not yotze. Now, v'afal pichen hochiach kan reish lakish mitzvah tzrichas kavana. So what is the proof now of Reish Lakish that mitzvah tzrichas kavana? Why not say mitzvahs ain't tzrichas kavana? And he's not yotze with the first tibul because he had kavana shalolotes. So he says, "Afal pichen ochiach kan Reish Lakish mitzvah tzrichas kavana mimashalo yotze dechavas mara betibul mishmei shesav Reish Lakish shal hoyel em lechachom l'sakin lechol mara betibul rishon mishum heker." Kemen shachilas mari mitzvah hamisura lekol. V'yeshlo yizoru lechamin shalolotes. V'yavoli de takola sheyasu betibul sheni brochel matola. So he has here a shtickle Torah, in the name of the Chazon Ish, that if, you could be yotze even without kavana, then you're really running a real risk, because there'll be people who will recite the bracha on the second marar, and that's a bracha levatol because they were yotze with the first marar, because mitzvah ain't tzrichas kavana. If you can tell me, well, we have to notify the people that they should have a negative kavana shalolotes, I mean, how are we going to guarantee that there won't be anyone out there who might not know that that he has to have kavanah shalol lotzes, and he'll end up with a bracha v'atola in the second mar. And now he quotes the Netziv Mivalozhin that Reish Lakish proves that mitzvah srichas kavanah mipnei shu sover shametabel shnei tibul v'chazeres tzarich lotzes yedei chovas marar v'tibul rishon. All right, that's the sugya later on, Rav Chisda. Al keni efsha lahoras lo shelo l'chavim lotzes. If he's eating chazeres for both the tibul rishon, tibul sheni, then Rav Chisda later on in the Gemara is going to establish that he's yotzei with the first tibul, and therefore we cannot tell him to have a negative kavanah, have kavanah shelo lotzes. No, that's impossible. He has to be yotzei with the first tibul. But if mitzvah ain't tzrichas kavanah, then for sure he's already fulfilled his chiyuv by virtue of the very act of achilas chazeres. But if mitzvahs ain't tzrichas kavanah, we have to worry about the possibility that he didn't have in mind kavanah shalol lotzes b'tibul rishon, and then he'll recite a bracha v'atola on the tibul sheni, thinking he wasn't yotzei the tibul rishon, when in fact mitzvahs ain't tzrichas kavanah. Now, if we move on here, which is number tes, so the hekel tinokos, according to Rashi and the Rashbam, is in the first tibul, because they never were used to a tibul before the suda. But if I hold mitzvahs ein tzrichas kavanah, and all he has for the first tibul is marar, then he has fulfilled his mitzvah of achilus marar with the first tibul, and that would l'chora undermine the hekera, because what he's eating the shem mitzvah is not, something superfluous and unnecessary, and therefore it's hekera. But the answer is, says the Meiri, that the heker here is the ribui of tibulin. In other words, the second tibul is implemented immediately after he eats the matzah. He hasn't yet gotten to the main seuda. So that's also a hekera. That's also some shinui that contrasts this night with all the other nights of the year. The Meiri also suggests that the heker is really in the first tibul, even though, according to mitzvahs lo tzrichas kavanah, he was yotzei the mitzvah of Mara with the first tibul, but the ikar mitzvah is the Mara that's eaten in the tibul sheni. So I'm not sure exactly what he means here when he says ikar mitzvah b'mar shenecha b'tibul sheni. After all, we're holding mitzvah saying tzrichas kavanah. He was yotzi already his mitzvah marar in the first tibul. So what does he mean that the ikar mitzvah's marar is in the second tibul? Why is that so? But he adds two important words. He says liachar hamatzah. What he means to say is that for sure he wants to bridge from the first tibul to the second tibul for the mitzvah of marar, because the second tibul is after the matzah, and the Torah says al matzah sumrom yachlu, matzah first and marar second. All right. Now the Gemara says the following. Maybe we could still salvage and defend the proof of Reish Lakish. The Gemara is going to now make an attempt to prove how Reish Lakish knows from our Mishnah that mitzvahs tzrichas kavanah, because if mitzvahs ain't tzrichas kavanah, then he was already yotzei his mitzvah marar with the first tibul. If you'll say, that the reason why you need two tibulim is because of mitzvah srichas kavana. Because if it was only because of the reason of what? Of heker l'tinokos, imkein lishma'inan b'shart yerokos. You want to tell me that the chiddush is that mitzvah srichas kavana and now you're arguing that even if mitzvahs ain't srichas kavana, but nevertheless he needs a tibul because of hekera. So the Tana should have taken a simpler case, a scenario in which he has shar yerokos. He's not yotze the mitzvah mora with shar yerokos, obviously, and the second tibul chazeres, that's where you have a heker l'tinokos. Why did he tell me a case in which he only had chazeres? And that was the only vegetable he had access to. It must be teaching me that mitzvah srichas kavana. So just to summarize, the Gemara is saying the unique chiddush here that Reish Lakish wants to derive from the Mishnah of mitzvah srichas kavana is based on the fact that the Mishnah addresses a case where he has only chazeres and no other yerakos. And it's telling me that if he had other yerakos, then enochinami, since mitzvah srichas kavana, he would not be yotze with the morer. And the tibul sheni b'chazeres, that's going to be a mitzvah of morer. So he has shar yerakos, and then everything could have been smooth here in shar yerakos. There's no l'chora at face value. There's no justification of the Mishnah mentioning a case of chazeres where he has no shar yerakos. But the answer is that the Mishnah wants to mechadish another chiddush, and that is mitzvah srichas kavana. And the fact that he only had chazeres for his first tibul, that was the only yerek he had, nevertheless he can still be yotze the mitzvah of morar with the second morar. And the reason for that is because mitzvah srichas kavana. Now the Gemara rejects this. And I'll tell you why the Mishnah mentioned here a case of Ein lo ela chazeres, he only has chazeres, has nothing to do with mitzvah srichas kavana, but rather shar yerokos. If the Mishnah would have said the first tibul is with a yerek, havamina, we would have mistakenly thought that hecha deika shar yerokos hu devinin trei tibule. If he has other vegetables, then there's a mitzvah of trei tibule. And that's called heker l'tinokos. Aval chazeres lechuda lo boy trei tibule. We would have come to the mistaken conclusion that if he only has one yerek named chazeres, then forget it, drop the ball on trei tibule. Because if you're going to insist on trei tibule, in this case where he has chazeres, and we're holding mitzvah saying srichas kavana, it means that with the first tibul of chazeres, he was yotze his mitzvah mar. And therefore, we're not doing this tibul for the purpose of heker l'tinokos, but rather to introduce the mitzvah of achilas mar, even though it's not yet the zman for mar. We said al matzos. Even in case where all he has is chazeres, be'inin trei tibule, we're going to require two tibulim. Ki hechi de lehevi bei hakera. Latino. So let's see if we could summarize the last the last piece of Gemara. We wanted to suggest that perhaps the proof of Reish Lakish is the choice of the Mishnah of a case where he only has Chazeres and not Shar Yerokos. And the Chiddush of the Mishnah is that he's not Yotzei the mitzvah Mar because he, in other words, let's go over it again. The Mishnah could have taught me a case where he has Shar Yerokos and he wasn't Yotze the mitzvah Mar, and the Mishnah is teaching me that he needs a second tibul of Chazeres, but at the same time, there's Heker L'Tinokos. So why did the Mishnah choose a case where he only has Chazeres? Must be to teach me, as Reish Lakish assumed, that mitzvah strichas kavan. And he wasn't Yotze with the first tibul, even though it was Bechazeres. So the Gemara rejects that. And the Gemara says that if the Tana would have mentioned this case of Tibul Rishon in Shar Yerokos, which was our whole question, in other words, the entire proof of Reish Lakish stands on that leg. Why did the Mishnah tell me Shar Yerokos? Unless the Mishnah is telling me mitzvahs tzrichas kavan, and therefore if he only has more, nevertheless he's not Yotze until he gets the second Tibul. But now the Gemara is saying no. That there's another reason why the Mishnah had to address a case where he has no Yerokos other than Chazeres. That's the only one he has. Now, your proof, Reish Lakish, was from the fact that the Mishnah chose a case where he only had Chazeres for Tibul Rishon, but he doesn't have access to any other Yerokos. But the answer is that the reason why the Mishnah chose a case where he doesn't have Shar Yerokos because if it would be a case where he has Shar Yerokos, I would have said that mistakenly again, that since he has Shar Yerokos, that's why he needs Trei Tibul. If he only has one Yerek, namely Chazeres L'chuda, Lo Boy Trei Tibul. And the reason for that is because since mitzvah ain't tzrichas kavana, he was Yotze with Chazeres in the Tibul Rishon, and if that be the case, then when he eats the maror before its time, meaning before matzah, nevertheless he was Yotze the mitzvah maror. And we don't want to do that because, as we said before, the mitzvah maror is mafkia. It's contradictory to the mitzvah to the purpose of hekel tinokos. So therefore, Kamash Malon, the reason why the Tana mentioned the case where all he has is Chazeres is to teach me that Filu, even though he only has one vegetable, namely Chazeres, Pin and Trei Tibule, we require nevertheless two Tibule, Ki Echid Levi Behekera Letinokos. Okay, now he points out here that the reason why Akero Tinokos is so important is because the mitzvah of Sipitis Mitzrayim should be fulfilled ideally with She'elo Tshuva. So we want to get the children asking questions here, and we're going to do a Akera to arouse their curiosity. So in footnote number Yudalid here, he gives a little bit of an overview. He starts with, on the second line, Tosis and Rabbeinu Peretz, that the proof of Reish Lakish is from the fact that the Mishnah addresses two tibulim with chazeres, and not that the tibul rishon was b'shar yerokos. And the Gemara rejects that to tell you there's a chiddush that even if the tibul rishon was b'chazeres, he still needs two tibul. So that seems to be the explanation here of the Rabbeinu Peretz, and then he goes on to Tosfos. The proof of Reish Lakish is from the fact that l'chatchila you're allowed to do shnei tibulim with chazeres, and the Gemara rejects this and insists that really he should be looking for another yerek. But the Tana is telling me that even if he couldn't find any other yerakos, then he should be mekayim the mitzvah of tibul with chazeres. Then we have the Ran, that the proof was why there is a tibul sheni, since he was already mekayim his mitzvah of morar with tibul rishon, and at the same time he could fulfill his mitzvah keruk because it's before the Suda. So therefore, why do we need a second tibul? And the Gemara rejects that because there is a heker in the tibul sheni, and the Tana wants to be mechadish that even though he was yotze his chiyuv mar with the first tibul, nevertheless he needs his second tibul for purposes of heker latinokos. Now the Gemara has another kasha, another objection to Reish Lakish. There's a brisa of Yotanya, and this brisa is addressing the chiyuv of achilas morar, and it says that even though he ate yerokos of morar when they were tevel before hafrashas maaser, but he did eat a yerek, is lo yatsi yedei chavasa. However, that's only because it was tevel, and that's a vadai that there was no afrashas mas. But achon t'mai, let's say you buy grains in the open market from an amoritz, and there's a suffix whether he was ma'aser or not. The Rabbanan required to be mafresh maser be suffix, and that's called t'mai, is yotza, even though, or shall we say, nevertheless, he was yotze is chiyuv. The Chachamim allowed, this is what I call it, Isur Gavra. The Chachamim allowed certain people to eat D'mai while others are prohibited from eating D'mai. So, for example, an Ashir, if he eats D'mai, he's not Yotzi's mitzvah. But an Ani would be Yotzi's mitzvah because he's allowed to eat from D'mai. But even if he was an Ashir, we're going to apply the principle of Migu, that he has the ability to be mafkir all of his nechasim, make them hefkir, and he could become an Ani. So you and I would have said, okay, an Ani who eats D'mai, let's say in the case of Morar, he would be Yotze because there's no Isa D'mai to an Ani. But if an Asher is eating D'mai, then he's enjoined from eating the Tamai, and that would therefore negate and undermine his mitzvah Mara. But we have a principle called Migu, that even though now at this moment he's an Ashir, he could theoretically become an Ani. And that's called Migu di boy mafkir noch nechase. He could be mafkir all his nechase. So therefore, even in the case of an Asher who ate Tamai, he could fulfill his mitzvah. So here in the commentary, he says that Isa Tamai Eino Lechumra Midrabanan. I don't know what he means by that. I would say it's only an Isa Gavra. The Chefza remains a Chefza de Torah. The Torah relies on Rov Ami Arts Ma'asrin. And the Chachamim were Machbir, and they said, let's not rely on Rov. Maybe it's from the Miut, and we're going to require a brand new afresh. So again, on a deraisa level, the Peros have a chazaka musar and rov hamioretz masrim. On a drabbana level, we're going to be choshesh for the miut, and we're going to consider it as if it's tevel. But since it's only an isa tevel on the gavra haraya, if he's a gavra menoshir, then if he was a gavra and ani, he'd be allowed to eat the tamai. So the very fact that you differentiate between an ani and an ashir, whereas an ani is allowed to eat tamai and an ashir is not allowed to eat tamai, that itself proves that we're dealing with an isa gavra, not an isa chefta. If the chefta was a chefta the isura, it wouldn't matter one bit. Okay. So where are we up to now? In the brisa of Dmai Yotza, the Chachamim again, as we said before, Matir Dmai for the Aniyim, and even in Oshir, B'di'evet was Yotze because of the Biyado or the Migu, as we call it, Migu Diboy Mafker Ilinichse. So that's the first din in this brisa. The brisa continues, Acholin below miskavin yotza. If he ate mora and he didn't have kavanah to be mekayim the mitzvah, he was yotze. And that's based on the principle of mitzvahs enam tzrichas kavanah. So far in the brisa we have two cases where he was yotze. Number one, Dmai, and number two, Ochlan below miskav. Now we have a third case. Acholin lechatzoyin yotze. Chatzoyin means chatzi shir. So he ate a chatzi shir, a chatzi zayis, and then he ate another chatzi zayis. Yotze. Somehow we're going to integrate the two achilos, each one of a half a zayis, to make it into a shir of kizayis. U'b'vad shelo yishe ben achila lechaver to yoser michtei achilas pras. So this is a halacha of achila toch kidei achilas pras. You and I would have said, wait a minute, he only ate a chatzi zayis. Then he took a break and he ate another chatzi zayis. I would not integrate the two into one achila. Each one was only a chatzi zayis. And therefore he did not fulfill his mitzvah of achilas mora. But the answer is no. as long as within a certain period of time, a window of time, which is called Tokdei Achila, he started his Achila and he completed his Achila. So the first Kizayis of Mara he ate at the beginning of the Shehiyah period. And the second half of Zayis of Mara he ate before the end of the Shehiyah period. Shehiyah means that, let's call it 9 minutes of Kedei Achilas Pras. So now what's the kasha on Reish Lakish? Vamai bakati mimai. I'm sorry. I got ahead of myself too fast here. So again, he ate Mara below Kavana. That was the first. And it says Achon below Kavana Yotza. So why is that against Reish Lakish? Right, Reish Lakish was deriving from a Mishnah mitzvahs tzrichas kavan. But here in this brisa it says mitzvahs ain't tzrichas kavan. It says achol below miskavin yotza. And where it says tanoi, he tzmachlokas tanoi. The Sanya Rabbi Yossi Omer, if a person only has one yerek, he has only chazeres. Afal pishet tibel. V'chazeres, he did the tibel rish v'chazeres, mitzvah lahavi lefanav, chazeres v'charoses. So he only had chazeres for his first tibel. Nevertheless, mitzvah lahavi lefanav, chazeres v'charoses, you need another tibel. So we see that he did not fulfill his mitzvah of chazeres with the first tibel. And that's based on mitzvah tzrichas kavana. So even though you had a brisa that said ochlam below miskavin yotza, but here we have a brisa that says no, that you need kavana. That's why, even though he was tovel tibul rish, we still need a tibul sheni. So Gemara asks hakati mimai. How do we prove the shita that according to Rabbi Yossi in this last brisa? We're holding mitzvahs tzrichas kavan, Dilma kasava Rabbi Yossi mitzvahs ain't tzrichas kavan. a high devi'inon trei tibule ki hecheditevi hekerolitinokos. So again, how do we prove that according to Rabbi Yossi, mitzvah srichas kavana? Maybe really Rabbi Yossi holds mitzvah ain't srichas kavana. Why do you need a second table? It has nothing to do with the mitzvah of Mara. But rather for the mitzvah of Hakera, even though take a look in the Brisa, it says here mitzvah lahavi lefanim chazeres v'charoses. I mean, first of all, I don't know that that's for the purpose of Hakera if you call it a mitzvah. And secondly, he implies you have to dip it in charoses. Is that also part of Hakera? So the Gemara asks this question: Vakati mimai. How do you know that according to Rabbi Yossi, mitzvah is kavana dilma kasav Rabbi Yossi, mitzvah ain't sukas kavana? So the whole business here of a second tibul has nothing to do with the mitzvah of matzah, because of Mara, excuse me. He was yotze the mitzvah of Mara with the first tibul because mitzvah ain't shrikas kavana. So when it says here in the Brisa, mitzvah lahavi lefanu chazeres v'charosus, according to Rabbi Yossi, it doesn't mean because mitzvah shrikas kavana, but the second tibul of chazeres b'charos is only for the purpose of Hakera. So Gemara says in Ken, if the reason he needs tibul sheni and chazeres is because of Hakera, my mitzvah. Oh, our question. Why does Rabbi Yossi employ the word mitzvah to obligate him in the second tibul? It's not really a mitzvah at all. It's only a mice of Hakera. So if he was Mekayim the mitzvah of Achilas Mora, in the first tibul, and Rabbi Yossi's holding that mitzvah ain't tzrichas kavanah, so why do you need the second tibul? Because of Hakera, well, why do you call it a mitzvah? It's not to be Mekayim the mitzvah. He was already Yotzei with the first tibul. So the bottom line of this whole sugya is that we have machlokas tanoim regarding the din of Reish Lakish. And Reish Lakish works out well according to Rabbi Yossi, because mitzvah srichas kavana. So when Rabbi Yossi says mitzvah lahavi lefanav chazeres v'charoses, he's definitely talking about the mitzvah of Mara. Otherwise, he wouldn't have used the word mitzvah. He's only talking about Hakera. And why wasn't he Yotzi with the first tibul, which was the chazeres? Because mitzvah srichas kavana, and that's Reish Lakish. All right, look, I think if it's okay with you, Rabbosai, we should do a chazor of this sugya. It goes back and forth, back and forth. So I'm going to leave that in Mitzvah Hashem for tomorrow. So Jeff, you come on Tuesday, but Tuesday is Purim here in Efrat. I won't really be available, so I guess I'll wish you a Freilich Purim now. All right then? Okay, Shkar, thank you so much.